Well, here we are, folks. We're going to get back into our Ecclesiastes study, Lord willing, over the next few weeks. And so what I've decided to do today, instead of preaching a sermon sort of a thing, is to actually review the ground that we've covered so far. And so we're going to spend a lot of time looking through the first few chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes. And I would recommend having your Bible because we're going to be reading all of it. And then I'm going to be making some brief comments. It's going to be more like a classroom lecture than a sermon. And so that's what we've got to do today. And then, Lord willing, next Sunday we're going to be picking up with the rest of the Bible study in the book of Ecclesiastes. So turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, and I'm just going to read a section and we'll kind of comment on the big picture ideas and the way that Solomon frames his arguments and how the ideas are going to progress through the book. And then after we are done, we'll just be done. And then, Lord willing, we'll be able to pick it up next week. All right, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So Solomon identifies himself. There's only one man who was the son of David and king in Jerusalem for any length of time. A couple of them tried to declare themselves king, but they never were accepted as such. And so the author of this book is Solomon, and he immediately jumps into the theme of his book, and that is that vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And so we've got 5 repetitions of the word vanity or emptiness. The word is extremely important. We need to understand what it means to understand the book. It is speaking of a frustration, of a nothingness that is common to all life. And he's going to qualify that as we continue to read. He's not a nihilistic sort of a person. He doesn't believe that this means that everything is meaningless, but he does want us to understand that in certain situations, within certain contexts, we have lives that are absolutely empty, that are only going to be full of frustration, and that we need to be careful about how we approach life. So verse 3, he goes on to say, "What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun?" And then in the following verses, he's going to illustrate that with the cycles of nature. So the big idea overarching the whole book is that we live in a context of emptiness within certain situations. And then he's going to be illustrating that by asking, why do we work? What is the point of doing anything? And then we come across the second extremely important phrase at the end of verse 3, and that phrase is under the sun. And so when we put the idea of vanities, all is vanity, together with this idea of under the sun, we can understand the context, which is extremely important, the context that we have for the whole of the vanity scope of the book. And that is that if we live our lives only with reference to this earth, without reference to God, that is merely under the sun, then our lives are only going to be full of 5 times repeated vanity. So he goes on with his illustrations in verse 4 and says, "One generation passes and another comes, but the earth abides forever." And so life has a cycle. People are born and they live, and then they die, and their children live, and their children die, and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. And all these people have been cycling through the earth for about the last 6,000 years, hundreds and thousands of generations, and the earth is still here, and they are all gone. If you consider only as far as life is under the sun. So for instance, if you are an atheist, not a theist, if you do not believe in creation but in evolution, then you have nothing but vanity. Because all of these generations that have come and that have passed away, they are gone. And there is no retrieving them, there is no life after death, there is nothing. It is all vanity. He goes on to illustrate it after having said the earth abides forever. He also says that this is the way our days are. Not only our lives illustrate this vanity, but our days, because we have sunrise and sunset. The sun rises, the sun goes down, and then it hastens around the bottom of the globe to the place where it arose. The wind is also like this. The wind goes toward the south, it turns around toward the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. So we've got the sun, we've got the wind, we've got water. All rivers run into the sea, but somehow the sea is not filled up. to the place from where the rivers come, there they return again. And so all of these things are illustrating that if we look at lives only under the sun, whether it is our lives or as the cycles of nature, all we're doing is we're running in a circle. All we're doing is wearing a rut into the ground, and we're actually going nowhere. Now, he started this set of illustrations with an assertion that is framed as a question, and that is in verse 3, what profit has a man from all of his labor in which he toils under the sun? He goes on to return to that now in verse 8 after his illustrations by saying all things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, the ear is not satisfied with hearing. And so he goes on in verse 8 to tell us how it is that this vanity is achieved. He makes the assertion in verse 3 that there is no profit, only vanity and labor. And then in verse 8, having illustrated in verses 4, 5, 6, and 7, in verse 8 he says, here's why. Because you never see enough. You never hear enough. We are never satisfied. We always notice that there is something wanting, something lacking. Later in the context, we're going to see what this is. We're going to see that Solomon says that God has put eternity into man's hearts. And so we're going to understand that a little better as we discuss it later. But he's giving us a preview of the problem here. We never can be satisfied. Verse 9, he goes on and says, that which has been done is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it can be said, see, this is new? It already has been in ancient times. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of the things that are to come by those who come after. And so he goes on to say, well, maybe your response is, yes, I understand that my life now is going to be vain. That if I live without reference to God, merely under the sun, that my life will end and there will be no point to it. But maybe your response to that is, but I can still do good things for posterity. I can leave the world better than when I came into it. And so even though my life is going to end, I will leave something new. I will improve the world by my having been in it that will be noticed after I die. Solomon responds to that idea in verses 9 through 11 by saying, nope, you don't actually have anything new. You're just remembering old stuff that other people forgot. And when you remember the old stuff that other people forgot, well, it's going to be forgotten too. And someone else in 100 years or in 1,000 years, they're going to think of it again, and they're going to think that they thought of it for the first time as well, but that's not really how it works. There is no remembrance of former things. So anything that you think that you were significantly contributing to the world is actually just old news. All of this is vanity. You cannot leave anything to posterity. You cannot hope to achieve anything merely under the sun. So that's his introductory statement in verses 2 through 11. And it leaves us feeling pretty hopeless, which is the point of it. He starts it off by saying, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. He wants us to get this idea. And I think he's done an excellent job of it. Now he gives us a little bit more of an introduction to himself. He has made a great assertion. After having briefly introduced himself in verse 1, he has made a great and terrible assertion in verses 2 through 11. Now he's going to tell us why we should believe him, why we should find him qualified to make that sort of an assertion in verses 12 and following. I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. So Solomon, was king over Israel in Jerusalem, and in his kingship, this gives him special qualifications. And if you've got to the book of Ecclesiastes in your Bible, then you know some of Solomon's backstory. You know that his father was a man of war, making it possible for Solomon to be a man of peace. You know that Solomon, early in his reign, was given an opportunity by God to receive a gift from him. And the gift that Solomon requested of God was a gift requested in all humility. And that is that he would have the wisdom to rule God's people. And because of that, God uniquely qualified him to write about these things, because he was given time and peace. He was given the authority and the wealth of a kingdom that he could push the boundaries and go as far as anyone dared to go in testing things out. No one could say to Solomon, Solomon, that's not quite right. You shouldn't do that, except God. And so he was uniquely equipped to make this study. And consequently, we should feel secure in taking his conclusions at face value, because he was a man uniquely qualified by God to come to these conclusions. And he wrote this under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So what did he do then? What was Solomon's mission and goal? Because he obviously felt the vanity, and he was trying to address the problem of that vanity. And so he said, "And I set my heart," in verse 13, "to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of men, by which they may be exercised." Verse 13 sounds very bitter, doesn't it? He starts out by saying, my goal was to search out by wisdom to understand what God has for us under heaven. So if we leave God out of the equation and only live our lives here, what are we supposed to be doing? And what he sees is that if we leave God out of the equation, then all we've got is a burdensome task. All we've got is busy work. We've just got our lives, like I said earlier, of running in circles. Verse 14, "I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all this vanity and grasping for the wind." And this is a restatement of what we've already talked about. And he says, when I set out to do this study, I had hoped to improve things for people. But in verse 14 he says, "What is crooked can't be made straight, and what is lacking can't be made numbered." I went to work in this project to find a way to straighten what was crooked, and it didn't work. I couldn't straighten anything. I went to work to try to count things up, to put things in categories, to understand them, and through that understanding to apply wisdom. And I couldn't. I couldn't count them. Verse 16, "I commune with my heart, saying, Look, I have attained greatness, and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge, and I set my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly, and to perceive this is also grasping for the wind." And so he said, so my project was to, through wisdom, try to understand the purpose for our existence. I attained greatness in Jerusalem. I didn't have boundaries. And so I decided that I was going to try everything. The first thing I tried was wisdom. I tried to make the crooked things straight. I tried to count the things that couldn't be numbered. And I found out that I couldn't. And so I also turned out my heart to find out what was madness and folly. And even pursuing madness and folly only was grasping after the wind. Now, we know that pursuing only madness and folly is grasping after the wind, but he says here that wisdom is also grasping after the wind. Why? Verse 18, "For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow." So he says, my desire to straighten what was crooked, to count what couldn't be numbered, only put a greater burden on me, because with greater knowledge, with greater wisdom, I began to see more clearly all the vanity that I started to see in the first place that made me want to start this project. And it all turned out to be empty. And so all I ended up with, Solomon says, even in trying to find a way around this emptiness and frustration, is emptiness and frustration. He got frustrated, I think. And he said, okay, if pursuing wisdom isn't going to do it, then I will go down the path of madness and folly to a certain length. And I'm going to start it out in chapter 2, verse 1. He said, "So I said in my heart, Come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this was also vanity." Verse 2, I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does this accomplish? "I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven in all the days of their life." And so he talks about how he pursued pleasure for pleasure's sake. And he's been qualifying what he's been doing here in a number of different ways. He's talked about it as madness. He's talked about it as folly. He's talked about gratifying his flesh. And so he's trying a number of different things. And I don't think we need to lump everything that he says as all being madness and folly, because he goes on to talk about some of the things that he does here. And so I think we need to keep in our minds kind of a qualification that he gives us here, when he talks about how he was gratifying his flesh with wine, I think in everything that he did, while he tried stuff out, he was guiding his heart with wisdom. He was doing it as much as he could by staying outside of himself. He was doing things and he was observing himself from the outside. Now, having made that qualification, I would like also to say that no person is actually qualified to do this. When Solomon tried to do this, I think that he ended up tainting himself. I don't think that he was as safe as he supposed he was. Because when we fiddle around with sin, it is always going to have a bad effect on us. And so Solomon tried to work within boundaries, and I believe that he was more qualified to work within these boundaries than any of us are, but still it was a struggle for him. So what are some of the things that he did when he pursued pleasure? It wasn't all going out and pleasing himself with wine. Rather, he says in verse 4 and following that he made great works, and he gives us some examples. Houses, vineyards, gardens, orchard with all kinds of different fruit trees in them. And so Solomon pursued lots of different architecture. He pursued lots of different interesting botanical ideas. Verse 6, water pools, and from which water of the growing trees of the grove. And then he talks about some of the things that he acquired. I acquired male and female servants, and servants born in my house. So I had such a huge staff that my servants were getting married, and they were having children. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. And not only did I have lots of chattels, lots of servants and cattle, but I also had lots of liquid wealth. I had silver and gold, the special treasures of kings and provinces. I acquired also male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and we talked about how that has often been interpreted as singers, but it was actually probably also female concubines. And we know that he had many wives and many concubines, and they definitely led him astray later in life. And he also excelled in verse 9, more than all who were before me in Jerusalem, and also my wisdom remained with me. And so he says in all of these pursuits, especially those ones that were just building beautiful things, my wisdom was with me. And in those things where I was pursuing pleasure for pleasure's sake alone, I tried to do so in a way that I was almost observing myself. My wisdom was staying with me and qualifying and categorizing what I was doing. Verse 10, he goes on to talk a little more about it, saying, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. And this is an extremely important set of phrases. My heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. This is an idea that's going to keep on coming back into the text. And that is that while I was working in good works that were giving me pleasure, I received the reward of that labor. And that was the work itself and the pleasure of having done it, the pleasure of having built it. And he will go on, as we'll see in future verses, to say this is something that God has given us. God has made us to work and to enjoy our work and to enjoy the fruit of our labor. But here in verse 11, he said that while I was looking at it from outside of myself, I looked at all the works that my hands had done, and all the labor with which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. And here's why he found all this work of his so frustrating. He made many beautiful things. He could stand in the center of his kingdom and look out and see all the effects of his wisdom and his hard work. But then he turned to himself. He said, I turned to myself, verse 12, and considered wisdom and madness and folly. For what can a man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. And so Solomon says, I'm uniquely qualified to do all of these things because God has specially gifted me, and I'm not so sure about my children and my grandchildren. How are they going to follow this? What can they do? Because I feel like I've exhausted all the possibilities. I feel like I've done it all. Verse 13. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise man's are in his head, but the eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceived that the same event happens to them all. So it's better to pursue wisdom than folly. It's better to build beautiful things than it is to just pursue fleshly pleasures. But in the end, they all have the same result. The same event happens to them all, and of course that event is death. Verse 15, so I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it will also happen to me. So why was I more wise? Then I said in my heart, this is also vanity, for there is no remembrance of the wise than there is of the fool forever. Since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come, how does a wise man die? As the fool. And again, you have to remember that this is Solomon looking at things only with reference to under the sun. He's saying all the things that I built, all the proverbs that I arranged, if I look at all that I have done and only consider them within the context of under the sun, if I leave God out of the equation, then it's vanity. Now we know that Solomon knew God was in the equation. The Holy Spirit inspired Solomon to write these words so that thousands of years later, we have them here in front of us. And so it wasn't vanity. But if he looked at what he did without God in the equation, he acknowledged that all that he was doing would soon be gone, even the memory of himself. The conclusion is that in verse 17, his frustration becomes nihilistic. I hated life because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Then I hated my labor in which I had toiled under the sun. Because I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all the labor in which I toiled, and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. And this is vanity. I know, Solomon says, that someone, whether it's my son, grandson, great-grandson, someone who comes after me is going to wreck everything that I've done, and it will be gone. Therefore, verse 20, I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. He really resents the fact that he can't keep on living and enjoying the fruit of his labor so long as he's considering these things within the context of being under the sun. Verse 22, for what has man for all his labor and for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? For his days are sorrowful, his work is burdensome, and even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity, because he's worrying about the outcome of his work, whether it's going to last. Solomon's speaking from personal experience. He's saying, all this wisdom and all this work that I have pursued, I can't even sleep at night because I'm so worried that it's going to be lost. I don't even sleep well after having worked real hard all day. This is what wisdom and knowledge have given to me. They have given me only sorrow. That's chapter 1, verse 18. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So Solomon has defined that for us. He's illustrated with his own life. Consequently, he comes to his first mini conclusion. They're all kind of foreshadowing his ultimate conclusion at the end of the book. But he comes to his first mini conclusion. He says in verse 24, because of all this that I've said, nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw is from the hand of God. And so he takes us out from underneath the sun and introduces us to a conclusion of his studies in saying, because God is in the equation, and all of this vanity and vexation of spirit is not merely under the sun, God has made it so that we can enjoy our drink, so that we can enjoy our food, and so that we can have an enjoyment in our labor. And God has made us for this. He basically gives us permission to enjoy our work, to enjoy our leisure, to have a good life, because God made us for this. It says in verse 25, for who can eat, and who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good to him in his sight. But to the sinner he gives work of gathering and collecting that may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. So what is Solomon talking about there? Well, first of all, in verse 25, he says, hey, I've experienced all of this, and there's no one out there who is going to be able to experience it to the extent that I have, because I have no boundaries. Well, okay, I guess I shouldn't say quite that. He has boundaries, but he has less boundaries, and his boundaries are further out than any of us. None of us are going to be a king. None of us are going to rule a nation. None of us have been uniquely gifted by God with wisdom to rule God's people. We don't have the qualifications that he did. So he said, hey, do enjoyment. No one has tested it like I have. And when it comes down to it, when I put God back into the equation, I find that enjoying what I drink, enjoying what I eat, enjoying what I do with my hands is licensed. It is approved by God. He made me for it. He goes on to say in verse 26 then, because God has got a plan. God is sovereign. When I go out and I work in righteousness to do good things, then I am collecting in to enjoy life. And when a wicked man goes out and he does evil things to try to collect himself to enjoy life, all he's doing in the long run, within God's sovereignty, all he's doing in the long run is collecting to end up giving to a better man, to a righteous man. Now, we know that this doesn't always work out like this in life, certainly, but Jesus himself illustrated this in eternity, which I think is probably a good application of what Solomon is saying here in verse 26. When he used the illustration of the talents, he said that there was a master who had 3 servants, and he gave to one of them 5 amounts of money, he gave to another one 2, and another one 1. And the man with 5, he went out and he put it to good use. He worked under the sun, and he enjoyed his labor, so that he ended up not with 5, but with 10 talents. When the master returned, the one with 2 also grew his to 4, but the one with 1, he didn't put it to work. He said, I know that you are a hard master, and that I can't trust you with my well-being, because you will reap where you have not sown. And I was afraid you were going to do that to me. And so I took that money, and I wrapped it up in a cloth, and I hid it in the ground, and here it is, this dirty sack of money. And the master says to him, what were you doing? If you really thought that I was an unjust master, then you should have invested that money with investors. And they would have taken that money, and then they would have used it to get interest, and I would have at least a little more. No, what you're doing is not exercising careful obedience to what I have given you. Instead, you're just using excuses to do nothing. Take from that poor servant, that foolish servant, that evil servant, his 1 talent, give it to the one who had 10. So, from the one who did evil things was given to the one who had done good things, just as we see here in verse 26. But it all falls under God's sovereignty. All of this thing is from the hand of God. Verse 26, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. All right? Now, Solomon, having tipped his hand about the sovereignty of God, continues in that theme through chapter 3. And this is that section that we're very familiar with, and it's all about what he concluded chapter 2 with, which is the sovereignty of God. To everything there is a season, and for every purpose, a time for every purpose under heaven. Whose purpose? God's purpose. So all of these things that we're going to read now in verses 2 through 8 are within the context of what God is purposing. There is a time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to gain and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time of war and a time of peace. And what all of this is saying, and we can go in and we can dive into and slice and dice all these statements and give illustrations of the times of God in our lives. And that's not inappropriate. We're not going to do that today because we're trying to kind of get a big picture. And the big picture here is that all the times of our lives, whether we perceive them as good times or bad times, whether we perceive them as a time to gather or a time to lose, a time to love or a time to hate, whether we perceive that we are at war or we are at peace, all of these times are within the scope of God's sovereignty because they are all founded in His purpose. God is the one who decides our times. And so if we try to live outside of the context of God's existence, if we are living merely under the sun, we're missing the most important part of good living. Because without understanding that God is the one who purposes our times, we're going to have vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. We have to live within an understanding, within a context of the sovereignty of God. And if we don't, then our times will only communicate to us vanity and frustration. Let's keep on going in verse 9 in chapter 3. What profit has the worker from that which he labors? I have seen the task with which God has given the Son of Man to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time, and he has put eternity in their hearts, that no one, except that no one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to the end. And so what is Solomon saying here? What profit does man have if God is the one who is in charge of our times? Well, God has given us something to do, and in that he has made everything beautiful in its time. So God has given us something to do, and in that doing, in the being born and dying and planting and plucking and killing and healing and building and breaking and weeping and laughing and mourning and dancing and casting and gathering and embracing and in refraining and gaining and losing and keeping and throwing away and tearing and sowing and silence and speaking and loving and hating and in war and peace, God has a purpose in all of that. He has made everything beautiful in its time. There is a time for all of these things. In addition to that, in time, God has a purpose, but outside of time, he also has a purpose. For not only is there a time to do all of these things, but he has put times, it's not its opposite, but its converse, eternity, into our hearts. In the middle of all of our times, we feel that we're missing something, that there is a hole, there is a void, or that there is something more that is to come. He has put eternity in our hearts, and we can't figure it out. God has purposes that we don't understand. No one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to the end. Consequently, Solomon comes to his second pre-conclusion passage. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy all of his labor. It is the gift of God. And so it's very similar to that same summary passage in chapter 2, how it is that we should be approaching life, understanding that God, in control of our times and his sovereignty, has good plans for us, and that we should enjoy the life that he has put in front of us, that we should enjoy our momentary pleasures, our food, our drink, that we should enjoy the labor of our hands, the things that we do to work, the things that we do to have fun in our hobbies. I know, verse 14, that whatever God does shall be forever. Now this is important because everything else that he's been saying up to this point has been vanity of vanities. It's part of this great spiral, this great cycle of forgetfulness and remembering, forgetfulness and remembering. God is different. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. God is not subject to this same vanity. What God does, it's finished. Nothing can be added to it. What God does, it's solid.